And probably what I should say is that we have a petition online, which you can look at and maybe sign. And I think it's at tiny.cc/A2MW. And we'll tell you that again a whole bunch of times. tiny.cc/A2MW. Okay, thank you very much. I will hand over to John.
To my far right here we have Dr. Roger Tatoud, who is an HIV expert and a senior program manager for the International Clinical Trials Research Management Office here at Imperial College. To my immediate right we have Dr. Andrew Hill, who will introduce more comprehensively just before his talk. To my left we have Professor Richard Barker, who joins us from from CASME, which I'm afraid, here we are.
Sustainable Medical Innovation.
Thank you very much. So the Centre for the Advancement for Sustainable Medical Innovation is very important in its structuring and launch. Professor Barker is an expert in strategy planning and analysis of healthcare and scientific research models. He has been the Director General of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. He's a member of the equivalent body across Europe, but also worldwide, the IFPMA, and also author of the book 2030, The Future of Medicine, Avoiding a Medical Meltdown, which is something we all want to do. And now, finally to my far left, we have Professor Ken Shadlen, who's a research fellow at the Department of Developmental Studies at LSE, and author of the book The Politics of Intellectual Property, which offers empirical analyses of conflicts over the ownership, control, and use of knowledge and information in developed and developing countries. He has particular experience and interest in Latin American systems and North-South trade agreements, and has been extensively involved in research around the role of IP and knowledge in development, including its relationship with public health. And so we'll be discussing with him today some of the ways in which IP laws can act as barriers in access to medicines and can prevent and restrict R&D in neglected areas, which incidentally is also an area of expertise of Dr. Roger Tatoud. So if you'd like to take us away with your experiences in this area.
Thank you very much. Thank you for promoting me to the rank of expert. Probably an expert in what I'm doing, but I'm not sure it's just HIV. So I'm employed at Imperial College as the senior program manager of an office which oversees the management of a number of clinical studies in HIV prevention, and that covers vaccine, that covers also microbicide, which you may have or may not have heard of, and I've been involved in other projects like pre-exposure prophylaxis, which you may have heard of in the media very recently. As such, I do work with philanthropic organizations, with public body, but also with the pharmaceutical industry for the development of new drug and new approach to HIV prevention. So what I do is translational research. I support taking products from the bench to the clinic. That's my job as an activist. I carry on working on HIV. You know, once you have a patient, you just go with it. And I've been interested in drug and access to drug some time ago, in 2006, but I'm still interested in access to drug, and especially for HIV. So when you think about HIV and you think about access to drug, you think about it for treatment, but you need to realize that this is changing, and drugs for treatment of HIV can now be used for the prevention of HIV, and I'll come back to that later, which increase the need and making them accessible for not just for treatment. So HIV, there is 35 million people. That's an estimate of people infected with HIV. Only 37% of these people have access to drugs. So that's not much. It's a huge improvement from the beginning of the epidemic, but still a lot of people who do not have access to treatment. What it means to develop new drugs or to develop a new vaccine means it starts at the bench. It means by researchers doing some basic research. That's usually funded by public body, not much by the pharmaceutical industry, for a very good reason. It's very time-consuming, and the success rate is very low. So the industry is not really interested in investing in that. However, when, as you said earlier, there is a promising molecule or a promising vaccine or something new, the industry gets in and then will take on the development. And the reason for that is that the academia or the university is not very good at doing it. So you can't avoid a relationship and a working relationship between the two. To give you an idea, doing a phase 1 study, which is a very early stage study of a new vaccine or of a new molecule, in the case of a vaccine, it costs about £1 million. Doing a phase 3 study, and I see a colleague of mine in the room, could cost in the range of 100 million if it's a very, very large study. So it's an expensive business to test drugs in clinical trial before they go into human as treatment. My role stop as clinical trial. I'm not involved in what happens next in licensure and all of this. So doing research is costly. The industry will support part of it. Most of the funding comes from government and philanthropic organizations. About 1.3 billion is invested every year in HIV prevention research. 2/3 of it goes into vaccine. Earlier you said, you have this researcher working in their lab and they are very happy with what they have discovered. But some of the time, what they have discovered relies on something else or someone else's discovery. And you need to access this product or this what we call background IP. And that's not always possible, and it may come as a cost. Once you have refined or developed your own product based on someone else's intellectual property, so you have used IP assuming you know it's intellectual property, you have what is called a rising IP, and then that needs to be exploited further. And again, that's not always straightforward because of the background IP. And there's a lot of discussion in academic setting at Imperial. There is a special organization called Imperial Innovation, which is dealing with the exploitation of a rising intellectual property that is growing out of research done in the college. The pharmaceutical industry is in it for the business and for the money. They are not a charity, and you have to accept this idea that they are doing it for the money. So sometimes when you rely on them to access one of their products to do particular research, they won't always allow you to access this product. And this is something that has happened to us in a number of cases where we approach the pharmaceutical industry, they agree to give us access to their product, and then they change their mind. Which means if you had planned to use their product, you can no longer do that, you can no longer carry any research, and you have to think about something else. Thinking about drugs that are licensed to use in human, there are a number of things that the pharmaceutical industry can do to, as you say, protect their right. So you have heard of the patent, which protects the right of the company to use and to make the product for 20 years. What happens after that, normally, the patent falls into the public domain, and any company should be able to manufacture a drug. So the trick here some companies use are evergreening, which is just changing slightly the indication of the drug, and then you can extend the patent. They could use frivolous patenting, which means you find another application, I think Viagra, for example, but that wasn't really frivolous. And they give another lifetime to the patent of their product. There are other ways of actually keeping control of their product, and you may have heard of the free trade agreement. There is currently one being negotiated between the EU and India. It has stalled. In this agreement, there are many more things than just access to drugs. There are agricultural products which are being discussed. There is a lot of things, and there are tariffs which are involved. And when these agreements are discussed, access to medicine and production of medicine is only part of it. If you look at HIV, India, and I think in particular it's CIPLA, produce 80% of the drug used in sub-Saharan Africa for the treatment of HIV. So this free trade agreement includes drug and access to medicine. Tariffs also control access to drug and medicine. In 2006, I was in Bangkok during the first or the penultimate coup, when the vaccine was thrown out. The junta came in and decided to issue a compulsory license under the TRIPS agreement that's allowed under the Doha Declaration of 2001. And as a consequence, the US started to be a bit unhappy about that and wanted to renegotiate a free trade agreement that was ongoing. And in this free trade agreement, it could be exchanging prawn for medicine. If your country, if one of the main exports of your country is rice or mango, or even actually prawn is one of the main exports of Thailand, they may actually control and tell you, well, okay, you're not going to export that to us, to the US, unless you accept all conditions on us selling you all product, all drugs to you, and you can't make drugs. So there was at the time quite an impressive lobbyist activity with lobbyists paid by the US who bought a full page in the Bangkok Post to denounce the junta decision to issue a compulsory license, which they are entitled to do under the TRIPS agreement. And if you know about the TRIPS agreement works for everybody, not just for the developing country. And they allow countries to issue compulsory license, which allow that country to make product that normally they couldn't make. And don't think that it's only the European country which are using these. The US is one of the main users of these TRIPS agreement, and for example, they have issued compulsory license of part of F-16 or BlackBerry because for them it had a strategic interest. So, what to do about it if you're an activist and you want to facilitate and to increase access to drug? You really have to understand the full process from the bench to the clinic, from the clinic to the patient, the licensure. It's not always pharmaceutical industry the problem. If you look here in the UK, access to medicine is decided by the NICE, for clinical excellence, thank you. It's also decided by a pot of money that are given locally to commissioners who are going to tell you, well, you have that much money, on what do you want to spend it? Do you want to spend it on this fantastic 3-in-1 drug for HIV, which costs 2 times more than this 2+1 drug for HIV? The two works the same, but when you are a patient and have to take drugs, it's usually easier to take one drug than to take 2 or 3. So that's important, but the economic component and the cost effectiveness is important. And the government, the NICE and other bodies play a role in access to medicine. So it's not just the pharmaceutical industry. Finally, if you decide to engage in that, I think you need to lobby to build some strong lobbying group. I'm not too much in favor for full frontal confrontation. I don't think it worked very well. It's about knowing who's who and working time and again, convincing the right people, talking to people in public health in England, writing to the ministry. I think that's how you can achieve more than full frontal confrontation. It's not easy. It's a long and difficult road.
Interesting, the emphasis you place on the working relationship between pharma and academia being unavoidable, and I'll be sure to grill Professor Barker on that in a few moments. What I just wanted to clarify with you is the figures that you cite for the cost of the different phases of clinical trials. Could you just repeat those for us, please?
So for a phase 1 vaccine, HIV vaccine, it's between 800 and 1 million. A phase 3 is difficult because we haven't done phase 3 vaccine in this country, but there was a big phase 2B done in sub-Saharan Africa and the US, and I think it's in the range of probably $50 million. We had here in the UK a big microbicide study which was running across 16 sites in sub-Saharan Africa, 6 countries, 9,500 women. The cost of that was about £50 million. Mm-hmm. And you need more than one to get a conclusive result. You need more than one to be able to license your product, because the regulator, the MHRA in here or the FDA in the US will want to have more than one trial to support the licensure of a product. But that's a regulatory path, which is something a bit different, but also important in access to medicine. If I, for example, thinking about PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, the drug exists, they are licensed, but the decision to use them rests with the Department of Health.
Okay, so it's not just as simple as
it's not just
having the results and then that's it.
It was a very long process. The development takes between 10 and 15 years.
Right. Just by the way, for everyone here, if there's anything that Dr. Tatoud has discussed in his speech that you would like to question later on or discuss later on, please make a note of it, and we'll be inviting contributions from the audience a bit later on this evening. Now I'd like to turn to Professor Richard Barker, to my left here, who has extensive experience in the pharmaceutical industry and representative bodies. So, Professor Barker, can I invite you to...
Yeah, let me start. I've been taught that audience engagement is absolutely critical, right? So, WHO has an essential medicines list. Right? You just need to think of the percentage of the essential medicines list that's on patent. Right? Who thinks it's less than 20%? Right. Who thinks it's less than 10%? Some well-informed people, it's 5%. 5% of the WHO essential medicines list is still on patent. So the biggest problem is to solve how we get the off-patent medicines. I'm going to come back to your questions, but bear in mind that the majority of the products that the developing world needs are available freely off-patent and are largely made in India, where India has 70% of its population who don't get the WHO essential medicines list. Right? So the biggest problem if you're a rural Indian in getting essential medicines is not patents, it's the supply chain and the markups that occur between their own Indian generic manufacturers and rural Indian population. So it's important to kind of clear away the oversimplification that we're going to get into, that the problem here is somehow patents. We'll get back to patents, but patents is not central to this problem. Let's think about the roles of the players, and Dr. Tatoud was very good about this, but I'll add a couple of bits to this, right? So if you're a researcher in academia and you find something in your Petri dish, that is fantastic, right? That happened in academia for one of the HIV medicines I know. Then that in fact did get licensed to a company, but that company had to make 800 different variants of that chemical to get one that worked in man, right? They then had to do all the things that Roger was saying. They then have to do clinical trials, the first set of trials, a few million, second set of trials, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions, right? They will not do that work unless they have profit at the end of it. Now, does that make them evil? Well, probably not, because as you get older, you will be expecting your pension funds to invest. Those pension funds will buy stock in pharmaceutical companies, and they will only buy stock in pharmaceutical companies if they have some protection for the hundreds of millions of pounds, dollars, euros, whatever it is. Right? So it's really important to realize that this is not a question of finding who's guilty. It's a question of how do we engineer this system to deal with the problems that were up on those slides. How can we get partnership between the profit-seeking industry and the academic researchers and the people who want to get those products freely to individuals in the developed or indeed the developed world. The problem I have in talking about this is I wear a number of different hats, right? So I just came from chairing a charity which is called International Health Partners, which gets donated medicines to crisis situations, Gaza refugee camps, and suits to the Ebola-affected areas of Africa. So I kind of see this from the charity perspective. I am on the board of a large pharmaceutical company that it has very expensive medicines that the developing world can't buy. I'm also on the board of a much smaller company that's got something that might be part of an eradication therapy for HIV, because it sort of gets the HIV virus out of the depots. And I am, as you say, I'm interested in new models through CASME. And I know the CEO of Cipla, who's a friend of mine, and he's doing fantastic work. And that is an Indian company that isn't just profit-seeking; it actually tries to do what it can for this. So the trick here, I think, is to figure out how can each of these players fulfill their own individual drives and requirements. Because who could disagree with the goal of this meeting? Right? Who could? It's like world peace and eradication of hunger. Who could disagree that everybody should get access to all the medicines we can possibly give them in these kinds of these situations? But it's really important to have in mind that this isn't therefore a game of finding who the culprit is for this problem. And it's certainly not patents, because I can tell you when you're sitting inside a pharmaceutical company, unless those are protected in some way, the drive that there is in a private sector company to get stuff out of the lab, create variants of it, put it through this really expensive development, then launch it on a global basis, that drive doesn't exist. So the alternative of getting the governments to do it, I guess we've played that game with the Russians, right? What came out of Russia, what came out of China, nothing came. So unless you've got the driving force that the private sector provides, you don't get the future. It's okay to deal with the present. It's okay to say, okay, well, if we abolish patents today, we could indeed get much less expensive drugs to all the people in the world. We just wouldn't have them in the future. The whole pipeline would then dry up. So what's happening at the moment, there's a lot more pressure to get tiered pricing, so that the developing countries get a better deal for the drugs that are still on patent. There's a lot of work to give drugs for free programs. So the IHP charity I just came from is seeking to try and get a virtual pharmacy so that you can pick donated drugs from the so to speak, the warehouses of the world's pharmaceutical companies and match them with demand, whether it's a crisis situation or a low-income country. And we've got to do a lot more on supply chain, right? So that's the big problem in many parts of the world. It's not the availability of drugs. It's the fact that we don't have viable supply chains, even if the drug is being given away. So there's an anti-malarial drug that Novartis has been giving away in Africa. The problem is that nobody knows who needs it in the field, right? And so there is no decent supply chain, and things that there's stockouts and so on. So we've got to build supply chains that really work for those kinds of diseases. So the challenge, I mean, I think we've got a great panel here, but the challenge that the whole room ought to try and embrace is how can we bring these different parties together to do a better job of solving the problem that we all want to solve. Why don't I stop there?
Thank you very much, Professor Barker. It's interesting in your talk that you emphasise a focus on issues separate from patents. I think I think everyone in this room is going to be solution focused rather than problem focused. Do you not think, though, that there are other ways of stimulating research other than a 20-year monopoly? There's been recent talk in academic circles, particularly the Consultative Expert Working Group of the WHO, of delinkage of the cost of R&D from the market price. For people who are unfamiliar, the idea here is that funding from philanthropists, government bodies, other sort of alternative financing mechanisms are used to develop grants and prizes which are used as push and pull mechanisms to incentivize research. With that in mind, you can consider the 20 years of profit from a patent to be a big old pull. Do you not think there are other ways of going about it which do not restrict other people's capacity to produce these drugs?
In certain circumstances, yes. So take antimicrobial resistance, right? You can give me 20 years of patent life, but I'll still not do it because the drug you want to keep on the shelf for the last cases that fail all of the others. Right? So it isn't profitable even, whatever the patent life is. So there are places for these kinds of prizes, for sure, when the normal market mechanisms don't work.
Okay. And it was interesting as well that you suggested that governments, you pointed to the USSR as an example of a failed government-driven R&D. What do you think of the work of scholars such as Mariana Mazzucato, who points to the vital use of government investment to drive innovation and prepare the ground for R&D of private actors? So, for example, the enormous funding of R&D by the National Institute of Health in the US and the medical research councils here.
No, Mariana's right. I know Mariana quite well, and we can have quite lively debates. What she really wants to do is to get government more into the translational thing and not just funding basic research. And she points out that in many sectors of the US economy, government actually getting more into translation. I'm not really talking about pharmaceutical, but government's actually supporting, for example, the growth of the internet. Mm-hmm. Right? That's what they did at the beginning. She's trying to defend that is a perfectly legitimate thing for governments to do. So I think we see more spending on translational research in government, and I think that is thoroughly good, actually.
There's absolutely no question that patents are irrelevant for most drugs, but there's also absolutely no question that there are certain areas where patents are relevant. It's not one or the other. So I'm going to talk about patents, and I have 7 points that I want to make, and I'll make them all very quickly. The first one is just to clear up some basic definitions. We keep on hearing this term, the patent gives 20 years of protection. It's important to remember that the patent lasts for 20 years from the date of application. And in the case of drugs, the time from when you apply for the patent, which is very early, to the time when you actually have a drug, to to the time you then do the clinical trials, to the time you actually then have authorization to put that drug on the market, you're burning up a lot of the patent time. So the effective period of protection that a patent usually gives is somewhere in the area of maybe 8 to 10 years. You might think that's a little bit of time, you might think that's a lot of time, you can debate that, but it's different from 20 years. So that's an important point. Second point is that that actually makes pharmaceuticals different than a lot of other things. So you all have, and your mobile phones all have lots of patents too. But in the case of other technologies like an information technology, the applicant applies for the patent and launches the product at roughly the same time. And I just said in pharmaceuticals it's different. You apply for the patent, but you don't launch the product, if you ever launch the product, which usually you don't, for another 10 years or so. That's a big difference. The other difference is that the patent, the technology that you're getting protected in the patent in pharmaceuticals is useful for the whole 20-year period. In the case of your mobile phones, it's not. By the time the mobile phone on your Apple iPhone expires, one of the 6 gazillion Apple patents at a time, the technology is completely obsolete. So that means that in pharmaceuticals, there's a concern with using the whole period. The patent period, when they get, the patent period all gets used. So there's an obsession with the full term, and then maybe even extending the full term as much as you can. So the third point I want to make, which I think is often forgotten about, is that patents are national. When you have a patent on something in the United Kingdom, it gives you absolutely no rights whatsoever in Egypt. You have to get a patent in Egypt. And if you have a patent in Egypt, it gives you absolutely no rights whatsoever in Brazil. You have to get a patent in Brazil. And I'm not going to list all the countries in the world because I'll run out of time, but you get the point, right? A patent is a national right of exclusion that gives you the right to exclude in the countries where you've obtained the patent. So you go about trying to get a patent in every country that you want to basically have that right of exclusion. But just because you have that right of exclusion here doesn't give you any rights outside of the border of the United Kingdom. It's actually even true in Europe. Why does that matter? And this is where things get interesting, is that most people that I talk to don't realize that pharmaceutical patents are new in most of the world. If we were having this conversation 20 years ago, most countries, especially most developing countries, did not grant patents on pharmaceutical products. That's really important. That doesn't mean that basically you applied for the patent in India and you applied for the patent in Brazil and they had a different criteria for deciding whether to give it to you or not to give it to you. No. If you applied for the patent on a pharmaceutical product in almost any country in the developing world, up until sometime in the 1990s, which I'll come to my next point, the examiner would have looked at it and said, this is non-patentable subject matter. You can't get a private right of ownership, private right of exclusion over this type of knowledge in this country. Pharmaceutical patents were new. Most countries said you cannot get a patent on a pharmaceutical product in this country. The situation changes in the 1990s with the inclusion of an agreement that's called the TRIPS agreement as part of the World Trade Organization. The WTO is the international body that has a gazillion and one different agreements in it. One of those agreements is about intellectual property rights. One of the things that the TRIPS agreement says is that all countries must grant patents on pharmaceutical products. That's huge. They didn't have to do it before. So what the rules are saying is that as of the 1990s, what the rules are saying is that if you want to be a participant in the global trading system, you must grant patents on pharmaceutical products. When in the past, you would grant patents on pharmaceutical products for other reasons, not to obtain market access as a participant in the global trading system. That's a whole new world. I don't have a presentation here, but I have a slide that I often give in lectures in which I show what the world of pharmaceutical patenting looked like in 1990 versus what the world of pharmaceutical patenting looked like in 2000, and it's incredible. It's a huge, it went from sort of switch from off to switch from on. It's called, you think of it as the universalization of pharmaceutical patents. I always tell my students that the single most important thing about the TRIPS agreement is that countries that were now required to grant pharmaceutical product patents when they didn't before. This is a shock to the system. Another slide that I would put up if I had a prepared presentation is if you look at sort of the level of development, and we're going to sort of use GDP per capita as a proxy for level of development, no problem. for countries when they adopted pharmaceutical product patents. So 1976 in Japan, 1978 in Italy, 1986 in Spain, much longer here, much longer in the US, Germany, I think 1968, whatever. And then you compare it with developing countries when they did it. Developing countries are adopting this new system of pharmaceutical product patents, again, because the WTO rules compel them to do so, at a much lower level of development, with development being the indicator of that being GDP per capita. Why might this matter, other than basically some people might say, hey, it's not fair. But why might that matter? Why do I call that a shock to the system? Well, the level of sort of the GDP, the level of income, wealth of the country is likely to provide a useful indicator of a few things. It might provide a useful indicator of the ability of the country to manage a patent system effectively to avoid granting crappy patents that should never be granted. Maybe not, but it might be. It might be an indicator of the ability generally of the country to combat some sort of anti-competitive practices that firms might do to extend their periods of protection longer, say to keep generic participants off the market. We see this in the news all the time about about collusion between brand name firms and generic firms to delay the period of market entry. Antitrust regulators get involved in that. It might be that the ability to regulate that sort of malfeasance, or alleged malfeasance, I should say, might be a function of the level of economic development. Finally, the ability to regulate prices, to put in a price control system and monitor throughout the country might be a function of level of economic development. So I think it is a shock to the system. Countries are adopting or have adopted a new type of pharmaceutical product patent systems at a level of economic development which is much different than when pharmaceutical product patents had typically been adopted in the past, and that there are reasons to think that is going to matter. And finally, my seventh point, I think I have maybe 2 minutes for this, is that ultimately everything, from a developing world perspective, ultimately everything comes down to one country. And it's all about India. Everything's about India. And the reason why is that when the TRIPS agreement comes around and says all countries must adopt pharmaceutical product patent systems, it had all sorts of transition periods. There's lots of debates about questions about how countries went about doing so. Do they do it now, or do they wait? Do they do it retroactively, or do they only do it for drugs that are new at the time that they switch into it? India basically implemented its TRIPS sort of obligations in the most minimalist way. India waited until 2005 to start granting patents on pharmaceutical products, and even then, and didn't do it retroactively. Basically, India treated the obligations of the TRIPS agreement as sort of the ceiling. It would do that, but it would do no more. Most of the drugs, virtually all of the drugs that are used for antiretroviral treatment in the developing world are not patented in India. So in the introduction that you gave before, you said that basically that in the early 2000s, the brand named firms allowed the Indian firms to produce generic versions of these antiretrovirals. Actually, though, that's not true. They didn't allow them to do it. What allowed them to do it is that they weren't patented in India. Nobody could stop them. There's questions about whether or not the international buyers would purchase these drugs. That's where a big fight was. But nobody could stop Cipla and the other Indian firms from producing these drugs because these drugs were not patented in India. And these drugs will never be patented in India. The problem is going forward. Because everything that we've experienced, everything that we've talked about, all of the increase in the access to medicines in 2000, roughly less than 5% of the people who needed antiretroviral treatment in the developing world were getting it. And now something like 60% of the people who are receiving antiretroviral, who need antiretroviral treatment are getting it. And they're all getting it basically with cheap Indian drugs. Those drugs were never patented in India. And they'll never will be patented in India. But people aren't going to be able to stay on those drugs indefinitely. People are going to need new drugs because they develop resistance to new drugs. People have to move to a more updated treatment regimens. And the new drugs will be patented in India. In fact, many of the new drugs are patented in India because 2005 is no longer yesterday, but 2005 is now 10 years ago. So even if a patent is applied for in 2006, and even if we take in this long period of the delay between application and launch, which is where I started, we're now getting to the period in which drugs are patented in India. For the most part, all the talk about patents in India was basically speculative. What's going to happen when drugs become patented in India? We're there now. The drugs are patented in India. The 2005 transition period is receding more and more into the past, into the distant past each day. So the problem is going to be going forward.
Thank you very much, Chris. There's a lot of sort of interesting content there about patents and their impact certainly in the international arena. What do you think about the way patents are actually used? There's a different question between sort of what's permitted in the and what's expected in the international legal framework of TRIPS and the WTO. But do you think that patents are sometimes applied? I mean, we heard from Roger on the end about how the evergreening practices and so on to extend the life of drugs. Do you think that should be taken into account in the international legislation, for example?
So I think that actually is taken into account in the international rules. So the problem of what's called evergreening, which is essentially the serial application for multiple patents on different forms of the same drug that are applied sequentially, and so therefore will expire sequentially, and so they could extend the period of protection from 20 years from the date of application to when the last 20 years from when the last drug is applied for. That is a serious problem. But the TRIPS agreement doesn't prevent countries from dealing with that. In fact, that's a serious problem here as well. That's a serious problem in the US. Every country that grants pharmaceutical patents is concerned about the sequential accumulation of patents that are going to extend terms. Developing countries have all sorts of different ways within the TRIPS agreement to try to stop that. India has a way of trying to stop that. The Brazilians have a way of trying to stop that. There's all sorts of experiences of countries having, which I'll have to talk about later, instruments that they put into their patent systems to try to stop that. And those instruments are entirely compatible with the TRIPS agreement. So the TRIPS doesn't stop that. Whether or not those things work is another question. But
I feel like this is a huge area of controversy internationally, is the use of compulsory licenses and parallel importing and so on. Some companies withdrew their drugs from Thailand because compulsory licenses were issued. Others have withdrawn their drugs from Greece because parallel importing took place. These are things that are perfectly legal in the international framework of rules, but they are seen as somehow inflammatory or unfair in international trade. What do you think about that?
no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the US government right now is just finished on the 31st of October an out-of-cycle review of India's pharmaceutical, I mean, basically India's intellectual property policy. What they're obsessed about was the pharmaceutical patent system. And the things that they're concerned about are things that nobody disagrees with the fact that those things are entirely compatible under the WTO rules. The point is that to look at it in the simplest way, I said before that the Indian government treated the its TRIPS obligation as a ceiling. It would do that and no more. The US government has always wanted countries to do much more. And so the conflict is not really whether or not countries implement their TRIPS obligations, it's whether or not they implement their TRIPS obligations and just their TRIPS obligations, or whether they exceed them. And that's what the international conflict over intellectual property is, that we just talked about in Thailand, and we're talking about in India. That's what the conflict is. It's over. So you're absolutely right. There's the formal rights that countries have under international treaties, and there's the effective rights that countries have because they face other bilateral pressures. I happen to think that India is not very susceptible to these pressures. They're just going to keep on telling the US, you keep on having your out-of-cycle reviews and threatening us, but it's not going to get anywhere. So I don't think India is particularly vulnerable to these extra pressures.
We're pressed for time, and we've still got another presentation.
Sorry, I'm happy to keep talking. No, but we want to hear the Hep C presentation.
Can I just say one thing about compulsory licenses? I think most countries don't want to use them other than as a negotiating tool, right? And so when you see this thing happening in Thailand, it's usually because the company hasn't sat down and had a sensible price negotiation. Because the tiered pricing would bring the price in Thailand to a much lower level than the price paid in the US. Because people know that they've got that in their back pocket. compulsory licensing. So it's not as if countries aren't aware of it. But what they do is they use it to get low prices.
But tiered pricing can never bring prices as low as generic pricing can.
Correct.
Market forces always will bring down the price lower than...
Totally
yeah.
right.
I don't know
And
if the audience knows what compulsory licenses are. Do you want to?
Yes, yeah, so I'll allow you to explain that.
Well, the compulsory license is just simply when the government gives somebody else the right to use the knowledge without the patent owner's permission. They essentially are compelling me to license my knowledge to somebody else. They're very controversial, and one of the problems also is you're not actually allowed to issue the compulsory license until 3 years after the patent has been granted, not just applied for, but actually granted. So they are of limited utility in that way. But that's all it is. It's basically I have a patent, and the government says somebody else can use that knowledge, and I can't go after them in court.
Equally, what I feel is overlooked in sort of mainstream discourse around compulsory licenses, if there is a mainstream discourse around compulsory licenses, is that they are temporary arrangements, and royalties are an integral part. So it's not as though the intellectual property of the pharma companies is being stolen. They are still being remunerated for that concession. Anyway, I feel we're pushing well into Dr. Hill's time, and this is a discussion we can return to later with some input from the audience, if you don't mind. Is that okay if we move on?
Of course, it's your show.
Okay, fantastic. Now, Dr. Hill.
Okay, thanks very much. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm going to go back a bit and look at the campaign to get access to HIV medicines. And we kind of take it for granted now. We've got all the 12 million people taking HIV drugs worldwide. And personally, where's it gone? I don't think it would have been possible without people like the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, without the Treatment Action Group, without the Terence Higgins Trust, and all the activists. And this is one of my first experiences of HIV. This is the World AIDS Conference in San Francisco in 1990. And, sorry, okay. Back then, there was no treatment, basically. There was one drug, AZT, and a few people got DDI if they were lucky, and even that didn't work. And the campaign to get access to get discovery and access to HIV treatments was very well organised. It was these people who were basically dying of a disease. This is a die-in during the conference, and this is what the I keep pressing the wrong button. This is American riot police, mounted police, riot police with riot shields, arresting people with HIV. This is how bad it was back in the late 1980s and early 90s. And I think without this, we might not have had such powerful treatments for HIV and the development of them. And it led to, I think, an inspiration across all diseases. Certainly, I think it's been an inspiration for breast cancer to get more access and talk about prices. And, sorry, I keep pressing that button. I need to do this. There we go. I worked for a pharmaceutical company back in 1999, and at the time there was this feeling that HIV in Africa was simply not treatable. The World Bank in 1999 put out a statement that we needed bereavement counselling for people with HIV in Africa because it just wasn't going to be possible to treat them. And there was a meeting of the G8 in 2000 where a guy called Yusuf Hamid, who was the head of CITLA at the time, I think you know him, he was speaking just after Jean-Pierre Garnier, who was the head of GlaxoSmithKline at the time. Jean-Michel Garnier had said, these treatments for HIV, they're very hard to make, they're very complicated. I remember a lot of people from pharma companies saying at the time, very, very difficult treatments to make. We're never going to be able to upscale production and treat all these millions of people. So he said to the GA, this is a very difficult situation. I just don't know how we're going to do it. And this guy, Indian bloke, nobody had ever heard of, he had two overheads. And he said, well, actually, I've made these drugs, and we've spoken to the FDA, we've produced pilot batches, and we can make them for $1 a day. And there were a few people at the time. I remember going to see Ute Langer, who was my PhD supervisor, and I remember saying to him, I think these drugs can be made for $500 a year. And there were various people sort of getting together and trying to get these treatments produced cheaply. And then you had Jeffrey Sachs and the Global Fund and Bono talking to Jesse Helms and PEPFAR. But it was a very, very hard process. And I guess what I'm trying to say behind this is the pharmaceutical industry didn't help. They didn't. They weren't the people saying this can be done. And this is what has really disappointed me, looking then at hepatitis C, where, so I was going to talk about compulsory licenses. I've worked with a charity in Thailand for the last 10 years, and they're an example of a country where they never got access to these drugs at these low prices. They're middle income, so they're not Africa, they're not, you know, the poorest, and so they had to pay prices quite close to UK, and so that's why they put in the compulsory licenses, because they just weren't getting access. And we were taking drugs out in our suitcases to Bangkok, we were getting them sent in from South Africa, and it was all very shady. But I think that's why they put them in, because the pharma companies that said, oh, we believe in access, let's get the drugs out for $1 a day after Tatoud already said it was possible. They then didn't provide access for middle-income countries. So, yeah, we're at 12 million treated. Now, where are we with Hep C? Now, this is also a viral disease. Kills at least 500,000 people a year. I think it probably kills quite a lot more because of its effect on the cardiovascular system. So you've got 150 million HCV infections versus about 35 million HIV infections. And there's basically no access to treatment. Nobody's getting treatment for Hep C. They basically just die in the most afflicted countries at the moment, mainly in Asia, some in Egypt. So we looked at, and this is, you look at the Chinese epidemic, 29 million people, India, 17 million people, etc. I'm not going to go through all of these. Even in Europe, only 3.5% of infected individuals have ever been treated, or have ever been treated by the end of 2005. And in the US, it's 1 in 5. So what we did, I'd done all this work on ARVs in the late 90s, and I published lots of papers saying, you can make these treatments extremely cheaply, and it's just got to be done. But I'm not the only person. A lot of other people are looking at it. And you look at HIV, where thanks to all this activism and pressure at the highest level, the cost of treatment went down from $10,000 a year to $100. It's the 100-fold reduction in the cost of treatment. The thing about the new drugs for hepatitis C is they have a very similar way of acting to the drugs for HIV. They're nucleoside analogues, non-nucleosides, protease inhibitors, all the classes of drugs that we're used to for HIV. So we looked at their chemical structures and how easily you could make them. And Bryony Simmons is at the back there. She's a master's student from last year, and she did a lot of the work, so thanks very much, Bryony. It's not all mine. So we looked at, I'm not going to go through all the details now. What I want to show you is people talking about patents earlier, and these are the patent expiry dates on the main drugs for hepatitis C. And basically we have another 15 years, where if we just follow the company's prices, we're not going to be able to afford it. Basically, these drugs are being sold, and if you take a combination of two new drugs, which are sofosbuvir and cimetravir, it's $150,000 for 12 weeks of treatment. $150,000. Now you multiply that up by the number of people with hepatitis C in the US, which is about 3 million, and it's larger than the whole drugs budget. All the drugs used in the US, it would be larger than that amount of money. In the UK, the National Health Service has said, we're just not going to pay for it. We're not going to pay for treatment for Hep C with these drugs because it's so expensive. They'll treat the first 300 really serious cases, and that's it. So we looked at, and again, lots and lots of details. So we looked at how much does it cost to make 1 gram of an HIV drug? And these are nucleotide inhibitors, about less than $1 a gram, maybe 50 cents for a gram of drug. How much does it cost to make? And this isn't just making it, this is selling it at a small profit from an Indian generic company throughout Africa and Southeast Asia. How much does it cost to make a different class of drug, a protease inhibitor? About $1, maybe $2 for 1 gram of drug. And again, this is sold at a profit, and these are the prices that drugs are being sold at to treat these 12 million people in Africa. So this is a sustainable business model. So we did the same for hepatitis C, and here's an example. There's a drug called daclatasvir, which they all have unpronounceable names, so you just do the brand name, sorry about that. And we had an expert chemist who'd advised the World Health Organization and the Clinton Foundation on prices of HIV drugs and their chemical synthesis, and he advised us on how you would actually make a drug like this, and the ingredients, how much do the ingredients cost? And you have all these funny companies in India and China that make building blocks for drugs. How much does each building block cost? So we calculated that, you know, I was saying that the HIV drug costs between about 50 cents and $2 a gram. We're very conservative. We put a high estimate in of $4 for a gram. Now, when you treat hepatitis C, you only need 5 grams to treat for 12 weeks. So 5 grams of drug at $4 a gram, $20 per 12-week course. This drug is being sold in the UK for $40,000 for that same course. And then if you look at the other treatments for Hep C, sofosbuvir, we calculate, costs about $100 to make and is being sold for $84,000. Cimetravir, which isn't on this list, about $100 to make, being sold for $75,000. So we looked at a drug for hepatitis B, which is only 0.5 milligrams per day. So you need less than half a gram for a year's treatment. It costs about $10 to make. It's being sold for $15,000. So I could go on for a lot longer. I think that the problem with all this is that the companies are not being honest enough about their real price structure. They'll say, I'm sorry, these drugs cost a huge amount of money to research, so we have to charge a high price. It's not our fault, our hands are tied. You look at the drug sofosbuvir there, it cost $100 per treatment course, and Gilead said, oh sorry, it cost us a lot of money to buy the company that bought it. They've already made the money back in 1 year, and the head of Gilead is a billionaire. His vice president is paid over $20 million a year. So this is not money going into research and development, this is money going into salaries. And why didn't they come forward and say, well, we believe that these are the costs of production, this is the cost of development, so therefore the cost should be this. I think the other problem with the companies at the moment is that, as a generalization, in my experience, pharma companies are much happier to sell to a smaller number of people for a very high price, and they'll get a big margin. And if you say to them, well, you know, there are millions of people with Hep C in the world, why don't you treat far more of them at a lower price? And you just get silence. So that they just haven't worked out this volume margin economics, which you'd think would be quite straightforward. Now, I know I've only got 10 minutes, so I don't want to keep going on and on and on. But just as a sort of general point, I think in terms of access to medicine, you have to kind of out companies. You have to really get down to the details of what they're doing. And when we did this project, there were actually 2 medical students who worked on this as well, and Bryony. And it was very hard to find this information. If you want to find the chemical structure, you want to find how a drug's made, you want to find the patent expiry date and all the details of the patent, you have to really dig down. And it should be transparent. Companies should say, this is how much it costs to make, this is how much we're spending on R&D, and therefore this is the price with a realistic profit margin. At the moment, it seems to be a free-for-all where the companies will say, well, we're going to charge $84,000, and I'm sorry, but we think it's good value. The health economics is often very, very grey, very, very hard to understand, and you can often disprove it. At the moment, Gilead's saying, if you don't get cured for hepatitis C, you might need a liver transplant, so it's worth the money because you're saving the cost of a liver transplant. Very, very few people who are infected with hepatitis C ever need a liver transplant. So if you're trying to organise this, you need a very well organised media campaign to highlight these issues in very simple terms. And the other thing is, never underestimate the power of a patient testimonial. Somebody with the disease saying, I can't get access to it. I've got a friend who's got hepatitis C, he's a film producer, And he's just been told by his doctor, I'm sorry, you're not going to get it because the NHS can't pay for it, it's too expensive. So he's got decompensated cirrhosis and he's stuck. It's people like that. You need to get actual stories about what's happening. Okay? Thanks very much.
Some pretty staggering numbers in that presentation, Dr. Hill. And it's quite compelling how opaque this process is.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a reason for that?
Why should a company reveal its cost structure? I guess companies in all sorts of spheres, does Porsche say how much it costs to make a Porsche? Does Microsoft say how much it costs to develop software? It's not something that companies do. But in this case, where people need access to these treatments, I think it's this argument is always trotted out. Research and development's expensive, blah blah blah. But the pharmaceutical industry as a sector is more profitable than almost any other sector in the FTSE 100. Now, research and development can't cost that much if these companies are that profitable.
And what was particularly compelling, certainly in the case of sofosbuvir, is that recently the United States government requested figures from Pharmaset, which is the company that developed sofosbuvir and was acquired by Gilead. And at most, it seems from their numbers, it cost $177 million in N, to produce sofosbuvir, when in 3 months they made $3 billion from that drug.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very financially driven industry. So I presented these results to the American Association for the Study of Liver Disease, and I had lots of financial analysts coming up to me, not necessarily doctors. I had people from the pharma industry, said 4 of them literally said, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to treat these people in Africa for Hep C? They're going to die anyway. They'll die of something else. I was shocked. I mean, maybe I've just had a very bad experience with the pharma industry, and maybe there are other sectors where it's like that. From my personal experience, I've been quite shocked.
Did you have a hidden mic?
I wish I had. I wish.
Now, I don't want to turn this into a finger-pointing exercise, and I'm very aware that I'm sitting right next to Professor Barker, who's worked with the pharmaceutical industry, and it's just interesting to hear from an industry perspective. What do you think of sort of numbers or these arguments that we're hearing Dr. Hill make?
No, I think the whole hepatitis C thing will be a bit of a how should we say it, a straw that might break the camel's back. There is the feel. Sorry, am I not speaking? I was trying to speak a bit louder.
There's a microphone, if you'd like.
Right. I just need to get an American accent. I had to say, I was on a plane the other day, and I had my earphones on and music playing. I could still hear what somebody from your wonderful country was saying. I need to develop this. No, I think the whole Hep C story, which I think you explained really well, I think is going to create a real force for change in some ways. I'd like to just respond on the cost effectiveness thing, because I was in 3 meetings in 10 days with a major US player, the Italian government, and the head of the NHS, and they all basically said the same thing, which is, I believe this is cost effective. I believe we're in a body like NICE isn't easily fooled, let me tell you, they're very rigorous processes. They think it's cost effective. The problem is not cost effectiveness, it's affordability. It's the fact that you have this huge bolus of costs, which are completely unaffordable, right, in any of these systems. And then you do benefit over a very long period of time. So in a cash-constrained system, just can't deal with that. So how it's going to work out, I don't know. I mean, I wish I was smart enough to know. I mean, Egypt, where there is a high prevalence, you say, Gilead's price is 1/10 of the prices you quoted, but they're still very high, right? So I don't know what price they're going to use in China. I'd be astonished if it was even 10% of their price. Because they are beginning to understand the point that you make about the growing middle-income countries. Why should we just defend the low-growth markets in the US and in Europe and forego all of those markets in middle-income countries, whether they be Brazil, whether they be India, whether they be China. So I think we're going to see a lot of change. I think the other point of your story, which I think is really interesting, is the way in which patient activism and regulatory flexibility and company research all kind of came together over about a 15-year period. The regulators were really flexible. I have a friend of mine who used to work for the FDA. His first day at work, they were throwing bags of blood at literally the walls of the FDA, basically saying, if you don't let this stuff through and let it through faster, you're going to be responsible for deaths, right? You understand that? And they got that point. But it took 15 years probably for all of those forces to come together and end up with actually treating a pretty large proportion of the HIV, not all, but a large proportion of the HIV patients across the world. I think it better not take 15 years for hepatitis C. It isn't about the production cost. It's fascinating to see those numbers, but I think you and I will both say nobody's pretending this costs a lot of money to make. There's a lot of arguments about the cost of research and development, but actually it's about should prices be developed in terms of the value they deliver, and what happens when the value they deliver is not affordable in the short term.
It's an interesting argument, thank you. What would you, Dr. Hill, I mean, am I correct in saying you're a clinician as well? You're not a clinical statistician, beg your pardon. What do you think of that argument that these drugs are priced in terms of the long-term value, the long-term societal value they can deliver, when I mean, presumably because of that price, many millions of patients are never going to see the cure that they could have in their lifetimes, with the lifetime shortened by the disease that could have been cured?
Yes, yeah, I mean, we've done health, I'm sorry, but I'm very mistrustful of pharmaceutical company health economic analysis, and you know, maybe NICE have scrutinised it and found it to be correct. We've looked at the number of people who have transplants in the short term. It's such a small number. The Californians have looked at it when they were questioning whether the drug should be introduced in California. They also couldn't find that saving in cost in the next 5 years. But this is important because in the next few years things could change so quickly that if you, let's say you put down £20 billion and you treated everybody in the UK at a very, very high price, which you considered cost effective now, isn't it better to wait for the prices to come down or force the prices down and then treat a larger number of people in the near term, in the next 3, 4, 5 years? Because the prices, I think, are going to change very quickly when various pharmaceutical companies come into the market together and there is this competition to get these, to treat these people and cure them before somebody else does. So I actually think that what you're saying is technically correct in the long term, in a lifetime analysis, but in a more tactical approach for the next 5 years, I think it could be disproved, and it could be found that it's better to wait for a lower price and then to treat the larger number of people in the next few years.
Thank you. I just have a question sort of related to the valuation analysis, when you're looking at the long-term societal value that's delivered by pricing drugs in such a way. This is the $84,000 being reflective of the benefit of this person presumably not passing hepatitis C on, or not requiring a liver transplant, or you know, the other implications of care with chronic hepatitis C infection. And also arguments about economic impacts. This person now able to work and contribute to the economy, and so on. But it's an interesting kind of flip side if you look in terms of supply and demand, isn't there? Because by saying that this price is so high, it's effectively limiting the supply that reaches the market, and thereby you're extracting. By setting the price that high, one is extracting as much value as they can from the much larger pool of people that could be accessed. I mean, but by saying we're treating 300 people with Hep C, then yeah, they're delivering a long-term societal benefit. But there were 216,000 people with Hep C in the UK. how much more value is there to be contributed to society by making that available? And do you think that by holding on to the Hep C, these new drugs for Hep C at such a high price, is it kind of artificial inflation of societal value to extract sort of more money, bluntly?
Yeah, I'm not here, by the way, to defend Gilead.
No, of course.
That might be too difficult. No, I would go with what Andrew was saying, which is you've got some follow-on compounds, right? And so you've got Bristol Myers Squibb, you've got other companies coming along. I would be astonished if the NHS was not going to negotiate pretty hard with all of them, actually, to get from 300, which is an indefensibly small number of people treated, to as many people as possible. Now, whether that solves the problem that, in a sense, we all started with, which is the less developed countries, I don't know. I think we might need to have other levers for that. But I would be astonished if the NHS wasn't a pretty hard bargain.
Thank you. Now, I feel like I've hogged the discussion thus far with these tremendously interesting men beside me. Does anybody in the audience have questions related to the discussions we've had so far? I'll take a few at a time.